Today we have our guest, Jake Hansen, a powerlifting coach, on the podcast. And I am very happy that he came on because he has an amazing track record with his clients. And he is overall just an amazing coach, very knowledgeable. He is young and charges not too much. And he is very reactive. He is learning what exactly each individual is doing that affects them to customize to themselves. He has coached athletes, he has coached older people, has coached younger individuals. He has a lot of knowledge that I think you guys are going to find very helpful. This is going to be everything you need as far as getting your progress, the basics towards your progress to the maximum. A lot of videos don't really cover the more in-depth things because they want you to pay for their products. This is going to be that free video that really has all the information you need to support yourself. I'm going to have the link to his YouTube channel in the description along with both of his Instagram accounts. So go ahead, give him a follow, support him, and I hope you enjoy the podcast. Thank you for listening. Could you tell me who powerlifting is for? Could athletes powerlift? Could you powerlift if you are old? How old can you really powerlift and how young could you start? Is there any constraints on powerlifting?
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, we could just dumb it down to strength training to start. Strength training in general is just going to be something that a lot of people should probably partake in some capacity, especially as you age. So you'll see a lot of times older individuals really just might struggle with um, just simple body movements. Something as simple as like getting up off the couch. Like strength training is going to be like a foundation of being able to just stay strong and stay healthy as you get older, like stay able-bodied. Um, hey, there's no real prerequisites to getting into it in general. A lot of the literature from my understanding is the injury rate within strength training is actually lower than other sports. So like if someone was to, I mean, you're more likely to hurt yourself probably playing like pickup basketball than you are to doing a squat or a deadlift. Now obviously that's just like an example and that's not always true in all cases, but in general, I think strength training across the board is going to be a good thing for a large majority of the general population. Um, Obviously we see it a lot in athletics. We see it a lot in even high school sports like even middle school sports. I remember in middle school they started us on some machines and stuff like that. We had like a lifting unit and stuff in PE class. So I would say in general, like working out, lifting weights, strength training, resistance training in general, like is going to be a good thing. Powerlifting specifically, there's definitely no prerequisites into getting into that. The only thing is we're training squat, bench, and deadlift specifically. So whether that's something someone might be interested in, it's going to determine whether or not they want to like I guess pursue the specific sport because powerlifting is a sport within strength training. So it's just going to be up to the individual and if they want to compete or not, I suppose.
Yeah, that makes sense. You talked about injuries, and something I hear really common from young individuals is they're scared to powerlift because they've heard it stunts your growth. Is there any truth to that you know of, or why exactly is that wrong?
As far as I understand, there is zero um actual like evidence that that's a thing. Some of the my understanding is it's probably not a great idea to do it prior to like puberty just because someone is, you are going through rapid growth. It's not going to stunt your growth. It's just maybe like lifting weights when someone's like 8 years old or 9 years old might not be the best course of action for exercise. Like they're probably better off just playing outside or playing sports. Those are probably going to be better avenues. But um, from what I've understood, from what I've read and learned, it seems as if once someone's kind of developed, they're not a little kid anymore. They're in their teenage years and whatnot. Yeah, you could start working them out. There's no evidence of heightened injury risk or stunting growth for that matter. As far as I know, again, I'm not a doctor or an expert on all of this, but as far as I know, yeah, there's no evidence linking to stunted growth at all.
Yeah, I've noticed that there's really no evidence in stunting growth. And one thing specifically is that the only reason it would stunt growth is if you injure your growth plates. And like you said, powerlifting is one of the lowest injury rate sports.
Hmm.
So you're more likely to have that happen in any other sport, basically.
Yeah.
And then also, powerlifting increases your growth hormone and your hormones in general. It supports them during puberty. So, if anything, I could see it having positive benefits during puberty compared to not doing anything at all or being at home stuck in your house.
Yeah.
My next question for you is, could you describe your programming style and really how it's changed over the years, how it's evolved? What have you really learned?
Um, so I've been coaching now for almost 2 years, and like in that time span, like things have definitely evolved. I would say in general, like it's hard to describe like a full system without like sitting down and going through hours and hours of information on like my programming. But in general, um, I mean, I mostly just coach powerlifters or people who want to train like powerlifters. I have a couple clients who maybe aren't competing actively, but their goal is to get better at squat, bench, and deadlift. So um, the programming itself is revolving around squat, bench, and deadlift and improving those lifts. We're not training like body parts per se, like a push pull legs type of split or something like that. We're training movements. So we're trying to set the squat bench deadlift up throughout the week in a way, and then supporting it with accessories and additional muscle building movements. So that way we can um, focus on progressing those lifts. Those are the markers of improvement versus someone else, maybe you're getting into working out and your markers of improvement might be body composition improvements, muscle gains. For us, I mean, those are important, but for us, the most important thing is going to be improvements on the squat, bench, and deadlift. Obviously, muscle gains, body composition play a role in those improvements, but um, specifically trying to improve the compound movements is going to be our biggest goal.
Along those lines, you mentioned that no specific muscle group is our focus because obviously squat, bench, and deadlift are compound movements, and we're trying to get those stronger. So we program in that direction. So a lot of people think that if you start powerlifting, part of powerlifting is losing aesthetics or not building much muscle.
Mhm.
Is there any truth to that? Could you be aesthetic while powerlifting, or is our aesthetic something you need to sacrifice if you want to truly get strong in the sport?
I wouldn't say you have to sacrifice aesthetics at all. I mean, if you look at the top guys in the not even just the smaller weight class, you look at the top guys in anything that's really not like super heavyweight or 120-ish, like 100 kilos and lower. There's some really jacked guys in those weight classes, and even the bigger guys, like they're obviously very jacked. They're just not going to be quite as lean. But like if you look at the top 82s, you look at the top 75s, you look at the top 90s, they're going to be very aesthetic. Like they're going to be lean. Um, we are trying to build muscle, like at the end of the day. So like we think of like a squat as an example. Um, if we're trying to grow someone's squat, like yes, squatting is going to be the basis of what we're doing, but we're gonna more often than not supplement that with additional movements, something like a leg press, a belt squat, leg extensions, hack squat, different muscle building exercises to supplement that squat. Same's gonna go for bench press, same's gonna go for deadlift. We're still trying to build muscle because at the end of the day, more muscle moves more weight, and that's just going to be like the basis of someone's like long-term improvements. So yes, we are still trying to build muscle. We do want to maintain relative leanness. I mean, maybe at the highest ends of the sport, we might, we if you want to be absolutely as competitive as possible, you might have to sacrifice aesthetics occasionally. Maybe we're not cutting down to that super low body fat range. Maybe we're not going through bulk and cut cycles and whatnot that maybe we might see a bodybuilder go through because we're trying to maintain, competitiveness within a weight class. But like for the general person, no, like powerlifting is going to be a great way to like continue to build muscle. We're still building muscle. We're still trying to get bigger, because that's going to help us get stronger. And yeah, we're not trying to just perma bulk forever and put on a bunch of extra fat body fat tissue. We want to maintain as much leanness as possible for majority of people.
So for somebody who wants to take an off season in powerlifting and switch more towards the bodybuilding end of powerlifting, focus more on the aesthetic sides, building their muscle groups that are lacking, really just building up the amount of muscle mass on their frame while still squatting, benching, and deadlifting because they want to maintain that. Is that going to harm their long-term progress at all? Or is that going to benefit it? Is there a more effective way to approach that if they're just training to failure that whole time, not really focusing on any RPE or reps in reserve scheme?
So in general, like building as much muscle as possible is going to be like the key, or I guess the ticket to continue to make progress long term. Like I like to describe it as like, sure, doing those back accessories might not benefit your bench press in the short term, but in the long term, like getting a bigger back and more muscular back, even though that's not exactly super specific to any of the main movements, is going to benefit you. Like never been anyone who has a jacked, upper back and lats and just is not great in the other movements, unless they've been neglecting the other movements. Um, so in general, right, like we want to structure training in a way where even in like an off season when we're trying to build muscle, which and I would honestly challenge the idea of an off season in a sense where we kind of always want to be building muscle. We really want to be in that muscle building mode up until maybe like 2 to 3 weeks out from a meet. Maybe we start pulling some of those accessories back, tapering those out. But in general, we're really looking to build muscle all the time. Um, a lot of times accessories are taken to failure or very close within a rep or two shy of failure a majority of the year for a majority of accessories. Obviously, there's going to be caveats, for example, like if we're trying to just get a little bit of additional stimulus through, let's say like someone's squat training, we're trying to get a bit of additional stimulus. And maybe we just use a belt squat and we do keep the intensity low there. But like in general, a majority of the year, we are taking accessories very seriously and we are training them very hard and going as hard as we can on those, and trying to progress those each week in each block. So I would say in general, like that's definitely not going to be a downside of trying to build muscle is only going to help powerlifters, especially younger powerlifters. You see a lot of times people get in the sport. You see this a lot of times with like teen lifters who are new to the sport. They sometimes neglect the muscle building, phase that early on you're going to be able to build as much muscle as possible. It's going to be easier to build muscle the earlier in your career. You definitely shouldn't neglect it early in your career. And then a lot of times what we see is these individuals neglect the hypertrophy movements. They maybe just squat, bench, deadlift. They're not training through other planes of motion. A lot of times they fizzle out, they get hurt, or they just kind of hit a wall progression wise, and then they have to kind of go back to the drawing board and look at maybe building some more muscle or another programming avenue, I guess, to explore.
That's I'm really glad you mentioned that. That's something I've mentioned a few times in my shorter form. I notice a lot of younger individuals just or newer individuals in general just wanting to chase the strength because they see their favorite power lifter, think they're cool, but almost all the power lifters I've seen have had a good amount of time doing bodybuilding or really just building muscle, building up their frame because if you have a smaller frame, if you skip that phase, I find that people are a lot more likely to plateau. Have you noticed that from your experience that when people skip the muscle building phase, they plateau a lot
Oh,
quicker?
100%. Um, I always tell clients like accessories are not optional. And you're still going to have people who it's going to be a challenge to get them to do them. But yes, like, I mean, accessories are a big stimulus of your main movements. So like if we look at someone's, maybe their bench press, maybe they're benching 3 days a week. And obviously the bench press work is 75% of it. That's what we're really looking at majority of the time. But we definitely want to plug and play with those accessories as well. That's going to be a way to introduce more new stimulus, different stimulus. Um, so yeah, I would say, especially in the long term, obviously there's going to be examples in the short term as well, but in the long term, when someone's not training their accessories, they're skipping them. Yeah, they are going to run into walls. They are going to run into plateaus with their progression. And it is going to be, something it's definitely not something we want to skip. We want to train, different muscle groups to really bring them up to support the main movements.
Yeah, I believe that was a key factor in me increasing my bench. I spent a lot of time working on building muscle more so than just trying to increase my bench in the moment. It's also what I'm doing right now. So that makes sense.
Mm.
But while you're on it, while you're on the idea of plateaus, say somebody hits a plateau, what exactly do you say they do next?
I think you have to look at programming, and again, it's a tough question to really dive into because we could talk on this topic for an hour. But I think the first thing you need to look at is like, what does your programming look like? If you're working with a coach, um, the programming generally might be more tailored to an individual's needs. So looking at volume, where is that at? Looking at intensity, where is that at? And looking at why is someone not progressing? Are we feeling maybe we're coming into a specific session that we want to feel really strong on, let's say like your primary session of the week, maybe let's say a bench press program, and we're coming into that session, just the bar's feeling heavy week after week. We just feel like we're hitting a wall. We have no strength, and we're feeling well recovered. It's not a recovery issue. It's almost just like a lack of juice issue. We can introduce more work throughout the week, whether that's intensity, whether that's volume. We can introduce that earlier in the week or around that main bench session to get that day stronger. The opposite's true. If someone's coming into, a session or multiple sessions or across the week, they're just feeling really fatigued, really beat down. They can only train maybe for a week or two before they feel like they need to deload. Volume and intensity might need to be pulled down, specifically volume in this case, pulling that down. Um, so that would be like that'd be from like the coach's perspective. Now, if you're someone who is just running a general template, or maybe you're not really running any sort of programming, looking for some program to write, maybe speaking to a coach, or finding a different template, or trying to make adjustments to the template itself with the things we kind of just mentioned might be an avenue to look at. So it's definitely like a loaded question. There's a lot to kind of go into. So I don't know if there's anything else specifically you wanted to hear.
Can we water it down to the basic issue is your fatigue management? Either you're not fatiguing or giving yourself enough stimulus, or you're giving yourself too much stimulus. Can we water it down to that?
Yeah, yeah. So the telltale signs is if you feel like, or if someone doesn't have enough stimulus to kind of to make progress, the things you're going to be feeling is you're going to be feeling well recovered all the time. You're never going to feel fatigued. You're never going to feel sore. Um, and we want to feel those feelings occasionally. Obviously, we don't want to be super beat up, but it's not a bad thing to be sore. The other thing you're going to feel is just weights that maybe haven't been heavy in the past or haven't felt heavy in your hands in the past are gonna feel very heavy. Um, you know, we've all been there when you unrack a weight, let's say a squat, and it's like, man, this is super heavy on my back. That's a telltale sign that maybe we need more throughout the week. Specifically in that case would maybe be intensity. And then like the opposite, where if someone's very fatigued all the time, they're just feeling very beat up, very sore across the week. You probably need to do less, probably need to pull it back a little bit. And we definitely in both cases, I would say you don't need to lift heavy every single set. You don't need to lift heavy every day. In general, I would, to really dumb it down, having like one day of all three lifts. So like one squat, one bench, and one deadlift day. That's like your primary days that you're really trying to lift heavy and do some fatigue. And then just find out what you need on those other days. Maybe if you're squatting twice a week, maybe that secondary day for you, or for someone who maybe needs less workload and less fatigue, maybe we're managing fatigue on that day. Maybe we're just doing a variation. Maybe we're just doing a couple sets, keeping the intensity low. And then the opposite would be if someone just really needs more workload, we can have a second really heavy day, and we can kind of have two heavy days. So um, it's about just taking what the athlete or what you might be feeling, whether that's fatigue or the opposite of fatigue, like over recovered all the time, and then just plugging and playing and adding workload where we might feel like we need it.
So the signs of fatigue specifically are that either your muscles are extremely sore constantly, your joints are extremely sore constantly, or you are feeling central nervous system fatigue. What are the signs of central nervous system fatigue? Is that something people should be considering?
I think central nervous fatigue can kind of get blown out of proportion. I think when people say, "Oh, my central nervous system is very fatigued," I think it's if they're saying that in the moment, so like let's say you do a very heavy set, and then a couple minutes later you're like, "Man, that really fried my CNS." I would say it's more of an adrenaline dump. Oftentimes that gets mistaken for an adrenaline dump, which is when we're lifting heavy, we our adrenaline spiked up. We're very intense. We're very hyped up. And then the come down effect is that you're going to feel a little more tired. You're not going to maybe have as much like mental edge and mental focus. And that's when a lot of times people will say, "Oh, my central nervous system is very fatigued." If we're talking about it in the broad scheme of things, if we take a step back and say, okay, we've had a very heavy week, and someone might say my central nervous system is very fatigued. I would challenge that that's more of just a global fatigue, muscular joint fatigue, just the individual is very fatigued, and it could be a mental fatigue as well. That's something else we need to look at. A lot of times when someone's doing too much workload, like mentally, they're just going to have a hard time staying focused and enjoying training. They're not going to enjoy going to the gym if they're very, feeling this global fatigue, muscular joint fatigue across the board.
I did Smolov Junior squat, and that's something I noticed very quickly. My mental state in the gym was not too focused. I was not having fun at the end of that.
Yeah, that's something to take into account. I think that's an overlooked thing with a lot of coaches and just people in general is we need to structure training in a way that's going to be enjoyable because a program or a training structure someone enjoys is what they're going to work hard at. And if they're not enjoying it, you're oftentimes just not gonna you're gonna struggle to work really hard at that. So it's definitely something to take into account. And it's definitely a symptom of kind of being maybe on the fatigue side of things.
Okay, so while we're on the topic of fatigue, what about rest? How much should somebody be resting in between sets, and how many rest days should people be looking to get?
Um, in between sets, I would say for like your squat bench deadlift work, I would rest about as long as you feel like you need. In general, like warming up, what I always tell people, warming up, you really don't need to take rest periods when you're warming up. So if you're working up to a top set, you really don't need to rest. Maybe you rest a few minutes prior to your top set, but in general, those weights are light enough. The volumes, you're usually just doing singles warming up to like some sort of a top set or straight set working sets that you don't really need to rest. Maybe as later in the warm-ups, we rest a couple minutes between sets, but between working sets, after a top set, that could really range anywhere from like 3 to 10 minutes. I mean, we don't want to get cold, but I would say like after some heavy squats, maybe we are closer to that like 7 to 10 minute range. Same thing with deadlifts, and then maybe bench press, we can generally keep it shorter. It's going to depend on the intensity of your workouts. If you're on a lighter day, let's say like a light bench press day, you might only rest a couple minutes, 1 or 2 minutes, 3 minutes between sets if it's light enough. Um, so it's going to be very dependent on the person for like intra workout rest. As for rest days, again, this is a very in-depth topic. What I like to do is I like to look at someone's schedule. How often can we train and how often does someone want to train? In general, the less amount of days they lift, the more stuff we're going to try to get through within each workout. And there's positives and negatives to that.
Is
I
that
would say
accessory specific, or is that squat bench deadlift specific that we are trying to get through more at? I mean, like, are we trying to turn it into more of a full body if you're doing less days?
yeah,
Or
and we can look at examples. But yes, like the less days we're training, the more. So if let's just say, for example, someone's going to train 4 days a week and we need to squat twice, we need to bench 3 times, and we need to deadlift twice. We're going to have to combine days. Like, I mean, there's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days to kind of, or seven compound accessory slots to get in there. We're going to have to combine days, or you're going to have to probably do like squat and bench together and then deadlift and bench together at least 3 days a week. Now, if someone wants to train 6 days a week, there's going to be a lot of days where we might come in and just bench press, then just do some accessories and get out of there. Where we could take the same frequency of 2 squat days, 2 deadlift days, and 3 bench days, spread it out among 6 days, and you're only really doubling up one day a week. So I like to look at someone's schedule and just kind of have that conversation of how long do we want to be working out for, how often can we get in the gym. The downside of like working out 5 or 6 days a week is going to be, a lot of people don't want to take the mental, I guess, that don't have the energy to devote 6 days in the gym as well as just the time to do it. I mean, we're busy. Uh, most people, powerlifting is not like the professional sport where we're making money off of it. Um, for majority of people, it's definitely a hobby.
So if powerlifting was their whole life or their whole focus at the moment, what would you tell them to go on? Would you tell them to do 6 days a week, 4 days a week? What
I think it's
exactly
going to
is your
depend,
go-to?
and some of that's going to depend on how much frequency we're doing with all the lifts. But I would say in general, like more days is probably going to be optimal. But that would be for someone whose life really is just structured around the fact that they train. Um, like if you can only get in the gym 4 days a week, it's much better to just schedule 4 days a week, maybe be in the gym a little bit longer, maybe have to double up some stuff and get all your workouts in on the scheduled days versus trying to schedule 6 days a week and spreading it out. But yeah, if someone can basically make their life revolve around powerlifting, I would argue probably 5 to 6 days a week is going to be better versus if someone's more busy, I would say 3 to 4. Again, it's just going to be dependent on the person. So, and in their frequencies at which they're hitting each lift.
What is your favorite accessory to program for lifters for each lift? And are there any specific accessories you like to make lifters more explosive, make them quicker on lifts, really get going if they're too slow on their lifts?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So I would say like when we talk about accessories, we definitely want to break it down lift by lift. So um just we'll start off with each lift with squat specifically. I'm really a big fan of compounds like leg movements. I'm a big fan of leg press. I'm a big fan of hack squat. I'm a big fan of belt squat. Those are probably my go-tos, really plugging one of those in, whatever either, if the athlete has something specifically they like to train, or if like we're looking at something, we're trying to target a specific um like a specific reason we want it. So for example, like a hack squat's going to be very much targeted on the quad specifically for most people, and then like a leg press is going to be depending on how we set it up. It's going to bias into the adductors more. For some people, again, it's going to be dependent on how we set it up, stance width, height on the platform where your feet are at. And then like a belt squat's just gonna be a really good example of just training through a squat pattern exactly, but taking the upper back or sorry, the taking the axial loading out of it. We're loading at the hips where it's a belt pulling at the hips down, and we're not loading the spine, so we can maybe save on some of the low back fatigue and that muscular fatigue related to putting a barbell on our backs, and just train the squat in the very specific range of motion that we squat. So that's a really good option. As for bench press, um, again, a big fan to really start things off with like the main compound. Well, let me backtrack to squat. Another option I guess would be like a Bulgarian split squat or just some single leg work. In general, the single leg work is going to be really helpful because one, we don't train by unilaterally very often. And then two, it's going to be really helpful for like teaching someone to center our mass management, and just kind of getting someone to be a little bit more athletic. So something like some lunges or Bulgarian split squats are my favorite. And then like if we're looking at something specific isolatory to the squat, hamstring curls and leg extensions are going to be the big ones. Maybe some direct adductor work. Over for bench press, then same thing. Big compounds, weighted dips. I've been programming um, uh weighted push-ups much more. So like push-ups, we put plates on someone's back. I've been programming that a lot more. I shouldn't say a ton, but I have a couple clients doing that, and I've never historically programmed that. So that's a new exercise I've been kind of mixing in. And then
That's interesting. Why? Why exactly push-ups?
so one, we're going to, and it's going to depend on how you set it up a little bit, but we can get into like a bench press specific like grip width. We can kind of get our hands in this grip width that we bench in a sense. Now, I don't think that's always how we want to set it up. I think a lot of times we can benefit getting a little closer. But the biggest thing I think that's maybe a little bit undervalued is the access to range of motion. We can go very far, like a long range motion. If we can set it up on dumbbells, we can get very deep. And then the other thing that I think is maybe a little overlooked is we get the scapulas moving. I think that's a beneficial thing. With powerlifting, a lot of times we're pressing and the scapulas, we're not always like pinching them and keeping them stationary. They are going to want to move a little bit during bench, but we're not actively moving them. And I think there's some benefit to getting the scaps like unsupported, and not having a bench pad. So if you're setting up on a machine chest press and you're pressing into that, your upper back is going to be very like really jammed into that pad versus like a weighted push up or a weighted dip for that matter as well. Like there is no upper back support. So I think there's some benefit to that as well. So again, it's not a movement I'm programming for everyone. The downside to it is you do have to have a friend or a partner setting plates on your back and taking them off. Um, but been a something I've programmed more. And then lastly, I would say a machine chest press is a good option just for additional pec volume.
Okay. You mentioned the stretch on push-ups.
Mhm.
What exactly is that going to benefit? In when I hear that at first, I think it's going to be best for lifters who are slow out of the hole, slow off their chest when they are pressing. Is that something you consider, or is it more just the person in general, whether they can
I
do?
would say it's more of a range of motion thing. So like a lot of times with bench press, we're setting our training up or setting our technique up in a way to maybe trim and shorten that range of motion as much as we can. And doing something like a weighted push up, like that's not really something we can do anymore. We want to move through a full range of motion. And that's another benefit to a lot of times the bench press accessory specifically is we want to be pressing through either like a different plane of motion or we want to be accessing longer range of motion because bench press itself, especially if you have a higher arch, wider grip, maybe isn't the best muscle builder. Not always the case, but for a lot of people, it's probably not the best muscle builder. And doing something like a chest press or doing something like a weighted push up is going to be a good option to access the full range of motion, really build resiliency in the full range of motion, but also just build muscle in that full range of motion.
And then you may have mentioned it, but what exactly is your favorite thing for triceps, or if somebody's struggling at lockout, do you have a go-to accessory?
Yeah, so I a lot of times I'm programming just tricep extensions. That's really the big one, and
Okay.
I usually leave it up to the lifter. I mean, if someone really wants a specific tricep accessory, or if I feel like there's a tricep accessory that is going to um benefit us, for training it through the shortened or lengthened portion of the movement. But generally, like I like to just leave it up to the lifter. It's typically going to be towards the end of the workout. So like I like to just, my favorites personally is like an overhead rope. So something with ropes that we're going overhead or like a kneeling rope. I like the kneeling because it's going to keep maybe a little less body swing involved.
So what are your favorite accessories for deadlift?
Deadlift, the big one's going to be RDL. I think, or Romania deadlift. I think that's going to be the most important thing with that is going to be learning to hinge, just being able to move through the hinge pattern, fully, which is going to carry over to squat and deadlift is going to be very beneficial. And yeah, squat and deadlift, sumo, conventional, both for deadlift, and it's going to be just super helpful for maintaining a proper start position and just understanding how to move through those movements. The other one that comes to mind is probably 45-degree hyper. I think it's a good low back, hamstring, and glute developer, a good way to just get additional stimulus in. The downside is it is going to induce a little more low back fatigue than maybe some people are going to be able to handle. And then lastly, I really like hamstring curls just because it's going to train, someone through knee flexion fully. And it's the hamstring that's actually getting trained opposite, the quad. So, I think it's just helpful for maybe an injury prevention standpoint as well. I would argue maybe that's not the reason we're always programming it, but I do think there's something to that as well.
And then what about upper back? You mentioned upper back earlier. What are your thoughts on upper back accessories?
Yeah, so um we definitely want to be training the upper back in upper back and lats and just the back in general, not the low back, but like the lats and the upper back, everything kind of mid back and up, and all the musculature there is going to be it's oftentimes not going to be a main mover. So when we think of main movers in the squat bench delta, like if we think squat, we think quads, adductors, maybe some hamstring and glute, um, hip extensors. When we think uh, like a bench press, we're going to think chest, triceps, shoulders. We think of deadlift, we think hamstrings, glutes, low back. So yeah, it's not directly the upper back and lats aren't directly moving loads, but it doesn't hurt to one get more musculature, and two, it doesn't hurt to be stronger through multiple planes of motion. I think there's something a benefit of being really good through like a pull down or a rowing, uh, movement pattern. Being really strong just in those movements definitely is not going to hurt. It's not going to make you worse. So I love to program all the back work for that reason as well. And again, it's just an area that we can pack a lot of muscle on. That's going to be supportive of the squat, bench, and deadlift. Even though it's not main movers, it's going to be supportive of those exercises.
Okay, good to know. So there's so many statistics in lifting from leverages to genetics. Everybody always thinks they're the outlier, is what I find. People like to either be the special case, the most elite end, or they like to use it as an excuse, say they're in the bottom percentage. Is there any benefit to really paying attention to these statistics? What are your thoughts on people's mindset on lifting from information they get from the internet?
Yeah, so obviously like genetics, it's going to play a role. We're going to have to look at like if your goal is to be the utmost competitive person you can be and be as competitive in the sport and as good in the sport, like if your goal is to win, we need to take a very like hard look at at someone and say, okay, like where are we at genetically here? Like we all know those people who come in the gym and the first time they work out, they bench 315 or something crazy, right? We all know those people. And some of us, it takes 5 years to get there. So it's going to be different for everybody. But some people are naturally just very gifted. But that definitely shouldn't like deter you from lifting weights. And I think even when you start, you shouldn't worry about that because everyone's going to progress at different rates. And there's always people are bound to get injured. People are bound to really hit their stride in training. I've known people who maybe looking at them at face value, you might think, oh, they're not, insanely strong. And then, a year or two goes by, maybe they clean up some outside variables in their life. Maybe they get with a different coach and boom, they blow up. In a year, they put on a bunch of strength on all their lifts, and all of a sudden they're pretty competitive. Um, the opposite can be true is where some people are maybe going to get really competitive early, and then maybe they just struggle to really maintain that competitiveness within the sport due to a multitude of factors, whether it's injury, whether it's lack of taking their training seriously, whether it's outside variables. So everyone progresses at different rates, and you never know when you're going to hit your stride. You never know when you're really going to pick up some momentum in your training, and training hard is going to be, the best way, as well as training for a long time is going to be the best way to get it, strong and as strong as possible. One thing I like to think about, like, I heard this online once and I think it kind of resonated, and I feel like it's something a lot of people can think about is like if we look at like high school athletics, like let's say like a high school basketball player, maybe that high school basketball player, maybe he knows, hey, I'm never going to play college basketball and I'm never going to go to the NBA, but they still play. You know what I mean? Just because you're not gonna, win worlds or whatever, doesn't mean you can't still powerlift. You can't still get stronger, and you never know. Everyone progresses at different rates. There's people who are gonna think they're not naturally as gifted as some, and all of a sudden they're gonna hit their stride in their training. They're gonna figure out something with their technique, figure out something with their programming, and you can blow up. So, um, it is gonna be something where I think a lot of people put too much into genetics. They sit there and they say, oh, well, I'm not genetically gifted, so there's no point. And I would argue that's not true whatsoever. Um, and some people are going to say, oh, well, I'm very genetically gifted. And then maybe they skimp out on some of the accessories or they progress too quickly. They're not managing their progression rates and they can get injured, things like that. So I definitely don't think it's something everyone should pay attention to right away. But like if your goal is to win worlds, or something you have very, very high ceiling, like, or high goals, you probably do need to look at your genetics or just how naturally gifted in your natural ability and take an honest look at that and see, is that a realistic goal for you? So,
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned the idea that it could be consistent or somebody could start off really good and they don't exactly need to have some people have linear progress and some people have plateauing progress. So your
Mhm.
starting point shouldn't be exactly what you're looking at. For example, I started off benching a lot less than a lot of my buddies. And
Mhm.
then over time, I made really linear progress. I kept on improving on my bench a lot quicker than other individuals just because I stayed consistent. So I believe that's a good reason to understand that you need to lift for at least 5 years, I'd say personally, to understand whether you really do have good or bad genetics, because who knows, something may click, like you said.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like I said, I've known people who powerlift their first couple years, they're not overly impressive with the loads on the bar. And all of a sudden they figure a couple things out, they figure some technique stuff out, and boom, they've improved a bunch. But again, even if you're not going to be like, I'm personally not someone who's genetically gifted. Like I'm probably never going to win worlds. I still enjoy training. I still train very hard. I still take my training very seriously, and I have goals that are achievable. So it's definitely not something where you definitely shouldn't say, oh well, I'm not built to lift, so I shouldn't power lift. Like that's not the case at all.
So I asked you about leverages. What exactly should people do about their leverages?
Um, I think we do need to take a look at leverages, and by leverages we mean like how well you might be built to do a certain lift. So the big ones that come to mind is gonna be like long arms are generally gonna be, if you have long arms, you're generally gonna be a better deadlifter, and then maybe you're gonna struggle at bench press. Short arms gonna be better at bench press, struggle at deadlift, or just not well built for that movement. Squat like shorter femurs, maybe a longer torso is going to be squattier, more upright squatter versus longer femurs, and a shorter torso might be more folded over. These are things we do want to pay attention to, and not because, oh, I have short arms, so I'm just never going to be good at deadlifts. Like that's not the case, but we need to pay attention to it from a programming standpoint. If someone has very short arms and they pull conventional, that program is going to look very different from someone who pulls sumo with long arms. So we're going to want to take all that information into account when program design, in terms of how much sets someone can handle, like so total volume, how many reps per set someone's going to generally be doing, like where that sweet spot is for them. What that average intensity and peak intensity is going to look like, as peak intensity more so the progression across the block. So we're going to want to take that information into account for sure. Um, I guess the other thing would be like with bench press, generally the thing we see is like shorter arms, we're gonna generally be able to handle less frequent, or sorry, more frequency, more volume, generally more reps per set for most people. That average intensity is probably gonna be higher and the peak intensity across the block is gonna stay higher. And then the opposite would be true for longer arm individuals.
So in general, better leverages means you could handle more load and therefore handle more improvement.
Yeah, I would say like better leverages, you're gonna be able to handle, like if you're better built to do a specific lift, you're gonna be able to handle more workload on that lift, more volume, more intensity. But that doesn't always mean you're going to be better at that lift than another lift. Like I know people who have very short arms who, are good deadlifters. They've just figured out something with their programming and with their technique that allows them to be good deadlifters. So it doesn't mean you can't get good at the lift. In general, I'd say on average, like the better leverage you are for the lift, the better you're going to be at it. But it's more so we're looking at program design as coaches, to try to build the total as much as possible.
And then do your leverages matter for sumo or conventional? How could one determine that?
So it's very tough to look at someone and say, okay, that's a sumo puller or that's a conventional puller. I mean, we can kind of do it. You kind of can see people. You see enough athletes, you kind of know. You can look at someone and be like, I think they might pull sumo. They might be better sumo. But there's so much that goes into play. One, you really need to train both and pit them up against each other to see what's kind of going to be stronger. So if you're a conventional player and you're thinking, I want to switch to sumo, you probably need to have a period of transition of learning sumo, keeping it very chill, very light, very easy, low volumes, lower intensities to kind of ease into it. And then, over time, you can kind of progress that sumo workload up and up and up as you can handle it. And then you really want to spend some time seeing, is it going to be stronger than the opposite, conventional? And then the opposite's true. Like if you start sumo and you think maybe conventional is the move, we're gonna want to spend some time building up the work capacity with the conventional before really trying to train it hard and see where we can get that like where that's going to be in terms of what your strongest deadlift stance is going to be. So it's going to come down to what's stronger for a majority of people and what's going to also allow you to train pain free and let squat flourish as well.
Great, thank you for that. Now, what about lifestyle? How much does lifestyle impact training, and how could an athlete go about their training?
Yeah, so lifestyle is very important. The biggest things is we're always, as coaches, we're always telling our athletes, hey, we need to try to stay on top of our variables as much as possible. And the big ones are going to be sleep, nutrition, hydration, especially in the short term, like leading into a session, we want to make sure we're drinking water. And then life stress. We're going to want to look at, you know, if someone's deals, has a very stressful work life, maybe their job is very stressful, we're going to want to adjust expectations with training and realize that maybe training is the focus going into the gym is not going to be quite as high, or we may not be recovering quite as well if these variables are a little bit out of whack. Not to say that they have to be perfect. I mean, by any means, there's a lot of people who maybe their sleep's not great, but they dial in what they can and it doesn't really affect them as much. But yeah, lifestyle is going to be important for kind of optimizing your training.
Great. So, do you want to real quick go into athletes?
Yeah, so um this is a good question because I actually currently coach someone who's a collegiate cheerleader. And when someone is doing other strenuous activities outside of training, that is stress. That is, think of it as training stress in a sense. So like I work with a collegiate cheerleader and with him when he's in season, like we're not doing as much workload as maybe normal. Maybe the accessories take a backseat. What we found success with was just pushing his SBD work, pushing the compounds, the squat, the bench, and the deadlift, and letting the accessories and stuff kind of take a back seat because he's getting that workload through his lifts at cheer. He's getting that workload through actually the sport itself. Um, so I think if you're an athlete and you want to get into kind of lifting heavier, like you just may need to adjust expectations. You're not going to be able to just, go ham on squat, bench, deadlift, and accessories. You're going to need to prioritize what you need to prioritize and figure out what is going to be the most important, what's going to be the most bang for your buck, and what's going to, allow you to recover because that sport is going to be fatiguing in a sense as well, onto, someone's body.
Great. So, many people think that coaching won't actually do that much for their lifts compared to pre-built programs. What exactly do you have to say for that? Because I've learned very quickly that's not true, but it's hard to see just looking at it in a broad sense.
Yeah, so working with a coach, the biggest things you're going to see is one, you're going to have someone who's going to be able to more individualize and tailor the programming to you. Um, Not everyone's not, everyone's different, but there's going to be, one thing that pre-built programs sometimes don't account for is body weight, sex. Those are the two big ones where heavier lifters generally are going to do less workload than lighter lifters, and then same true for men are generally going to do less workload than women, less volume, less intensity. So coach is going to be able to take that right away and just sift through that. The other thing with, having a coach is you have someone who has experience of working with a wide variety and demographic of athletes and have probably at some point worked with someone very similar to you, and have had success with someone very similar to you. So then working with them, they know exactly, hey, we can start with this. This is generally what I see works with this certain demographic of clientele. We can plug and play with that and start with that right away. I'd say the biggest thing though is you have someone with objective eyes on your training. So they're not going to be as emotional. I mean, they may be emotional about your training, but not to the extent the athlete will be, right? They're not going to be as emotionally tied to the training. They're going to be able to look at it
Okay,
with objective eyes.
that makes sense. And then how can somebody customize their program to themselves if they can't afford a coach right now?
I would say just play around with some different templates online. Just find templates that kind of work for you. But then from there, like just add a little bit of workload if you feel like we talked earlier in the podcast about adding a little bit of workload. We talked about maybe when someone might be fatigued, we need to pull it down.